Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy, where today we will look at the causes and events that led to the Civil War. When Southern troops fired on the federal Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina on April 12, 1861, the Civil War, America's bloodiest war, one fought by Americans against Americans, had officially begun. To many, this was a conflict that had been coming since the founding of the United States. So, how did it come to this? The issue over what was the cause or causes of the Civil War is one that continues to be debated. Some say that this was a war fought over states' rights versus a strong central government, and others that this was a war fought solely over slavery. Sadly, Americans are left to struggle with its legacy. As Harvard professor Drew Gilpin-Faust notes, most historians, however, are today united on the cause of the Civil War being slavery. And University of South Carolina professor Walter Edgar, a man who teaches in the state that fired the first shots of the war, states that the 160 men who voted to secede in South Carolina said it was to protect slavery. And in its declaration of secession, Mississippi explained, "Our position is, quote, thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow to slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization," unquote. Yet, Jim Loewen, author of the popular book Lies, My Teacher Told Me, says that 60 to 75% of high school teachers believe and teach that the South seceded for states' rights, which he claims, quote, is BS, and by BS I mean bad scholarship. So what was the cause or causes of the Civil War? As we will see, the conflict's roots go deeper than one single issue, but are ultimately tied to slavery. We see this complexity in what states want us to learn about the causes of the Civil War, many pointing to multiple causes, including economic developments or the relationship between the state governments and the national one, and the complexity of these key events that took place. And just a reminder, teachers at this PowerPoint with a wide variety of resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy. So let's try to break down the themes we need to know into different categories of states' rights versus federal supremacy, sectionalism, economic, political, and social. However, it's important to remember that most of these overlap. We'll start with the states' rights issues. For those of you who took our civics or government series, you know that the United States created what's called a federal system, a government based on the concept of federalism, in which regional or state governments would share power with the central or national government. Our wonderful Constitution, which has guided our country for almost 250 years, states that federal laws and the U.S. Constitution are supreme to state laws in what is known as the Supremacy Clause, while the 10th Amendment says that all powers not granted in the Constitution to the federal government will be left to the states. Early on in U.S. history, politicians broke into political factions or parties, with those who favored governing by a strong central or national government and those who favored states' rights. The industrialized North tended to favor a strong central government, while the agrarian South favored states' rights. In a previous lesson, we learned how states' rights politicians like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison epitomized this rising debate when they wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, introduced an idea that states could, quote-unquote, nullify federal laws if they deemed them unconstitutional. We discussed how John C. Calhoun used this argument to fight the Tariff of 1828, known as the Tariff of Abominations. Southerners who relied on imports for finished goods because they lacked manufacturing hated tariffs or taxes on imports. This led to the Nullification crisis, in which President Andrew Jackson threatened the use of force to get South Carolina, which had threatened to secede from the Union, to back down. As political and social debates increasingly turned to the institution of slavery, Southern states viewed the national government as overstepping their boundaries and imposing their will on Southern state rights. Next, let's look at economics. In previous lessons, we discussed how the North became more industrialized as mills and factories became a bigger part of their economy starting in the early 1800s. Meanwhile, the South continued to rely on farming, or an agrarian system based on cash crops. Many large plantations utilized slave labor to increase their profits. It's important to remember that northern merchants also greatly profited off of the crops produced by slave labor. We also learned in previous lessons how sectionalism, or a regional divide in political, economic, and social goals, developed between the North and South as their economic differences increased. In this sectional divide, Americans increasingly began to think of themselves as Northerners, Southerners, and Westerners. So let's turn to politics. As sectionalism divided the country towards different goals, these differences had political ramifications. When America began to expand westward, the question of where to allow slavery became politically heated, creating one of many ultimately failed compromises. The Missouri Compromise drew a line at the southern boundary of Missouri towards the west, stating that any state added above the line would become a free state, and states below it would be slave states. When Texans and Southern Americans wanted to annex or add Texas to the United States after they gained their independence in the 1830s, Presidents Jackson and then Van Buren didn't want to add another slave state, upsetting the balance between free and slave states in Congress. In our last lesson, we noted how manifest destiny and the massive amount of land acquired after the Mexican-American War further fueled the debate about whether slavery would be allowed into these new territories and soon to become states. Following the Mexican-American War, Pennsylvania Representative David Wilmot introduced a bill that would ban slavery from lands acquired from Mexico, known as the Wilmot Proviso. Although it didn't pass, Southerners who envisioned slavery expanding west into these new lands protested and helped defeat the bill. It's important to note that presidents were largely silent on the issue of slavery, not wanting to upset either side. 3 leaders in Congress stepped up to represent the different regions. John C. Calhoun representing the South, Henry Clay representing the West, and Daniel Webster representing the North. These 3 powerful senators, known as the Great Triumvirate, would dominate congressional debates over slavery leading up to the war. With both presidential candidates silent on the issue of slavery in 1848, a new party was established known as the Free Soil Party. This party wanted to stop the spread of slavery into the new territories. This political cartoon from 1850 shows the Free Soilers and abolitionists as dangers to the Union. In 1850, Henry Clay helped negotiate the Compromise of 1850, which, among other things, allowed California to join the Union as a free state, a stronger fugitive slave law, and the banning of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The Fugitive Slave Act produced deep resentment in northern states and helped increase what is called abolitionist sentiments. So as we look at the social causes of the Civil War, what role did abolitionism play? Many Americans had expressed abolitionist ideas, that is, the need to get rid of or abolish slavery, since its founding. Most northern states had abolished the practice in the early 1800s. In 1831, the abolitionist movement gained a strong voice with William Lloyd Garrison and the printing of his newspaper, The Liberator. Garrison was joined by the distinguished orator or speaker and author and former slave Frederick Douglass in calling for the emancipation or freedom of the slaves. However, many in the 1830s and 40s, including those in the North, considered them extremists and agitators, as shown by this painting of a riot taking place at a Douglass speech in Boston. In 1852, many Americans were exposed to the evils of slavery in the best-selling book Uncle Tom's Cabin by abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book, in addition to Douglass's autobiography, The Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, gave voices to those slaves suffering in the South. Again, the abolitionist movement gained ground with the passage of the Compromise of 1850. The despised Fugitive Slave Act stated that anyone who helped fugitive slaves could be fined or imprisoned. Many refused to obey this law, and many northern juries refused to convict those who had been charged. While social issues were further dividing the country, westward expansion threatened the political divide again. In 1854, as railroads were stretching further west, Congressman Stephen Douglas introduced a bill to deal with the issue of slavery in the new territories known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas introduced the idea of popular sovereignty, in which people would decide whether to create a free or slave state, ostensibly repealing the Missouri Compromise. Supporters of both sides poured into Kansas, and armed pro-slavery supporters, known as, quote, border ruffians, crossed from Missouri to vote. Violence erupted in the state of Kansas, earning it the nickname Bleeding Kansas in newspaper articles, after slavery supporters had attacked an anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas. With cannons and firearms, abolitionist John Brown led a counterattack, killing 5 pro-slavery settlers. To some historians, these were the first shots of the Civil War. By January 1856, with 2 differing governments and constitutions leaving Kansas in a stalemate, the Supreme Court stepped in an attempt to settle the issue once and for all. In 1857, a slave whose master had brought him into the quote-unquote free territories of Wisconsin and Illinois sued for his freedom in a case called Dred versus Sanford. In a decision that further outraged Northerners, Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that Scott was property and not a citizen, and he therefore did not have the constitutional right to sue. Taney also wrote that the government didn't have the right to take away citizens' property in any state, making the Missouri Compromise and Kansas-Nebraska Acts unconstitutional. As the nation stood on the brink of disunion, a new party, the Republicans, was formed in 1854, made up of anti-slavery Whigs and Northern Democrats. An 1858 Illinois senatorial race between Democrat Stephen Douglas and rising Republican Abraham Lincoln saw coverage of their debates and the slavery issue in newspapers across the country. Southerners, already feeling threatened by the rise of the Republican, were shocked when that Northern abolitionist John Brown led a raid on a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in hopes of provoking a slave insurrection. When he was sentenced to death, he would become a martyr to many in the abolitionist movement. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Southerners could see the writing on the wall. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina voted to secede or leave the Union. In February of 1861, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia joined South Carolina and seceded. In his inaugural address in March of 1861, Lincoln tried to convince the seceding states to rejoin the Union, pleading that a civil war was, quote, in your hands. However, he warned that the union of these states was perpetual, meaning forever. When the federal Fort Sumter was fired upon in April of 1861, Lincoln felt that he had no choice but to use military force to bring the southern states back into the Union. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas quickly voted to join the Confederacy. And with it, this long road to the Civil War had begun. So what were the causes? Was it slavery? Was it state rights? As we can kind of see, it's more complex than maybe just one issue. But the central theme of all of this disunion was slavery, a debate that only could be solved with the shedding of blood of Americans by Americans, which is where we'll pick up next time with our look at the Civil War. But before we do, let's review. Article 6, which states that the U.S. Constitution and federal laws are the quote-unquote supreme law of the land, is known as the Supremacy Clause. This amendment states that all powers not given to the national government are reserved to the states. The 10th Amendment. Which section of the United States believed in stronger states' rights? The South. What word would be used to describe the North's economy? Industrialized. How about the South's economy? Agrarian. This is the concept that the different regions of the country developed different identities. Sectionalism. This compromise over where to allow slavery to exist in the new territories drew a line west to divide between slave and free states, the Missouri Compromise. What compromises made up the Compromise of 1850? Well, California was admitted as a free state, it had a stronger fugitive slave law, and the slave trade was banned in D.C., and there's a couple others, but those are the main ones. This part of the Compromise of 1850 angered many Northerners. The Fugitive Slave Act. What was the name of the former slave and abolitionist who was known for his great speeches and a book? Frederick Douglass. This best-selling book exposed many Northerners to the injustices of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin. This compromise introduced popular sovereignty as a way for states to decide whether to be free or slave. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas earned this nickname as violence erupted there. Bleeding Kansas. This Supreme Court case further angered Northerners, ruling that slaves were property and had no rights. Dred Scott versus Sanford. This new political party, which featured Abraham Lincoln, called for ending the spread of slavery. Republicans. This man led a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in the hopes of leading a slave rebellion. John Brown. When this federal fort was fired upon, the Civil War began. Fort Sumter. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. I know that was a long one. Up next, we will have a multiple part series of the Civil War, so be sure to subscribe. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with worksheets, guided notes, lesson plans, Kahoots, quizzes, and additional resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Once again, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you ace that next exam of yours.